Welcome, Dr. Epic here. What we're going to discuss in this section is flowcharts, adaptive interfaces, caloric intakes, flowcharts, exactly what it means to do science, and finally, flowcharts. Because we're going to continue our exploration of the past, of the study of the past, the history of archaeology itself. We're going to follow that outline right up above me, so that outline should go in your notes to act as a guide for what's to follow as we proceed along our framework, our narrative framework of the past of archaeology as a three-act play. We've already looked at Act 1, the movement from antiquarianism to a scientific inquiry, and this was largely completed by the early 20th century. You have archaeologists who are looking at science, who are asking scientific questions. They are looking for evidence. They are refuting theories. They are supporting hypotheses. Now, the problem with that is that many of the questions that they're looking to answer are ultimately historical in nature. They're looking at occupational sequences. They're looking at the limits of culture, both in space and in time. And this ultimately produces a great deal of discontent. And this discontent amplifies itself in this new wave of young graduate students and new PhDs in the 1950s. And this eventually leads to Act 2, which is what we're going to explore here, the rise and fall of the new archaeology. The rise and fall of the new archaeology was an intellectual and theoretical movement against what they viewed as an obsession with history, what they viewed as an obsession with occupational sequences. They wanted an archaeology that would look at science. They wanted an archaeology that could answer really, really big questions about cultural process, about how cultures operate. And maybe if they can build general covering laws that can explain past human behavior, they can build general covering laws to explain future human behavior. It was a very ambitious intellectual program. And it was headed by a lot of different people. And there's just two of the guides I'm kind of mentioning right up above, Walter Taylor and Louis Benford. These guys served as sort of pathfinders for a large number of scholars, theoreticians, thinkers, and archaeologists, dozens of whom, hundreds of whom, were interested in a much more scientized archaeology. And as part of this, they revived evolutionary approaches. They sort of revisited a lot of this sort of 19th century sociocultural evolution and thought that these old ideas could be modified. They could be reinvigorated. And if we look at the archaeological record through highly scientific methods, and if we re-examine how we logically construct arguments, then we can build these general covering laws that can explain the grand evolution of human societies and possibly predict where we came from and whence we'll go. They wanted to look at cultural processes, which is the other name for the new archaeology. It is also called processual archaeology. It was kind of born in the 50s. It came to its ascendance in the 60s and 70s. And then it ran into trouble in the 1980s, where it experienced what can only be described as epistemological failure. But don't take my word for it. If you are interested in this type of stuff, I firmly urge you to read it. These guys wrote a lot. Now, some of the books are quite good. Some of the books are completely impenetrable. But here's probably the three best books written on the new archaeology of the 60s and 70s. New Perspectives, Study of Archaeology, In Pursuit of the Past. And what they're looking at is decoding the archaeological record, figuring out the laws that have governed human society in the past to see if they can determine how to figure them out in the future. Now, this was during the heyday of American science, capital A, capital S. This was American science in the glory days of the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project. They're putting a man on the moon and stuff. And this is the days in which physicists were almost like rock stars. And this is what they wanted to turn archaeology into. They wanted to transform the study of the human past into this highly scientific endeavor. They essentially wanted to take archaeology and turn it from a soft social science into a hard physical science. They wanted to turn it into something that looked like physics. They wanted to turn it into something that looked like chemistry. And this explains this obsession with flowcharts. So many flowcharts, so many flowcharts, all right? I mean, we'll explain a couple of these flowcharts as we go, but if you're wondering why there's so many flowcharts in this lecture, it's because that's what the new archaeologists were into. They looked at physics, and the physicists were using flowcharts. They looked at computer science, these early computer scientists, and those guys were using flowcharts. Ergo, scientists used flowcharts. Now, they did not succeed. Archaeology did not turn into a hard science. They never uncovered any general covering laws that govern the evolution of cultural processes in general human society. So, I'm giving you the spoiler right now. The new archaeology failed. However, while it failed in its goals, it did succeed in a number of key ways. It did greatly scientize the discipline. It forced archaeologists to explicitly state theoretical perspectives, to explicitly state what hypotheses are being tested and how the methodology is going to match each of these hypotheses. So the manner in which it failed is very intellectually and theoretically interesting, and we'll explore this as we go, because while the new archaeology did fail, it was in the end a noble failure. This is the way the new archaeology was supposed to work, all right? Flowcharts. Okay, so study that flowchart on the left, and I'll walk you through it, because this, according to the new archaeologists, was how archaeology was supposed to work. You start with a kind of general theory, all right? You have a general theory, and the way you connect the general theory to the archaeological record is through middle range theory. You build a series of connections between what they viewed as the static archaeological record and the past dynamic human society. So you have these combination of these static dynamic linkages, and you look at patterns in the archaeological record and the connections between the static present and the dynamic past, and this establishes signature patterns. So you're going to see these patterns over and over and over again in different societies and at different points in time. And then you're going to be able to study these patterns and consistently be able to connect the patterns in the archaeological record to the dynamic past activities in the human past. And then we're going to evaluate the strength of those inferences. And from that comes a deep knowledge of past dynamics. And these will then be turned into explanations and general theory. And these general theories will again go right up back to the top, and we'll go through sort of the coffee grinder one more time and become greater and greater refined every time they're tested. And eventually, the ultimate goal are general covering laws governing the behavior of past human societies. And these are explicitly just like sort of general Newtonian laws, that ultimately, if the new archaeology would have succeeded, you would have had like the first law of culture, the second law of culture, just like physics. That was the way it was supposed to work. Then the new archaeology combined evolutionary processes with cultural ecology. It had a touch of economics thrown in. And what they did is explicitly attempted to define human culture within very, very narrow parameters. And the definition of human culture was reduced to an adaptive interface between humans and their environment. That is all of human culture, all right? All of human culture consists of nothing more but an adaptive interface between humans and their environment. Culture is what people use to tackle the environment and to turn it into energy. And then they use energy to do their culture stuff. Human societies function in a highly systemized way, in a systematic way. You have a series of inputs, you have a series of outputs, you have a series of feedback loops, and once all of these interactions, once you can kind of figure out the general flowchart of human behavior, then you can address those sort of general theories. You can address those general covering laws about, human cultural development. Like, let's look at that flowchart right up above real quick. It's supposed to be like how, a human unit operates, how a courtyard or a household unit operates. You have inputs of crops, water, and fuel, and there's a feedback loop in which they feed themselves. But They're all, successfully adapting to the environment always leads to population growth, which means you have to either change your social structure, you have to have out-migration, or your surplus labor has to be fed somehow or has to be channeled. So you make surplus products and then you trade those, and things either are positive or negative feedback loops, which either leads to larger and more successful societies or traps societies into spirals of negative feedback loops, and the civilization ultimately collapses or is conquered or dominated by a sister civilization or a sister culture nearby. I mean, feedback loops, inputs, outputs. This is viewing human culture like it's a computer program, like it's physics. They're trying to explain human culture the same way that physicists explained how they could put a man on the moon. Now, with culture acting as this sort of adaptive interface between humans and the environment, it means that human culture is basically a series of practices that are optimized for any given environment. Hence, all cultures ultimately end up choosing the most efficient way to extract energy from their surroundings, generally as a function of technology and available resources. This means that very sophisticated mathematics can be brought in to economically model past human behavior, specifically in terms of how it adapted to the environment. For example, if you look at that chart on the upper left, you can see that it is making an efficiency argument. It's basically saying, okay, we've got to choose between vegetables on one hand and meat on the other, with time functioning as a kind of currency. With scarce time, what is more productive? Is it more productive to hunt, or is it more productive to gather for fruits and vegetables and nuts? And you can see there's an energy maximizing equilibrium. There's a time maximizing equilibrium. And basically they're looking at these ancient hunter-gatherers like these people are highly skilled, highly trained economists, and they're making highly energy efficient decisions. Is it more energy efficient to hunt one buffalo, or is it more energy efficient to hunt 20 rabbits in a given day? Are we going to extract more protein by fishing or more protein by gathering nuts, fruits, and berries? And the idea is, once you can sort of figure out what the optimizing behavior is, you can then model it and then test for that in the archaeological record. And go ahead and look at the flow chart right up above. You have feedback loops. Certain decisions have to be met. Is it digestive capacity? Is it food resources? What's the scale of mobility? Can a group be highly mobile with lots of young? Or are they slowed down? Do old people slow down the mobility of a group? Is high mobility even desired? What is an optimal relationship between population size, technology, and food resource? All of this was an attempt to create this hard science of archaeology, an archaeology that looked nothing like history, an archaeology that looked nothing like social science, but instead an archaeology that looked like physics, an archaeology that looked like chemistry. So here is basically another organizational flowchart of how cultural evolution is supposed to work. So we have a given population at the top, and it's a given population at a set technology level. And it expands its resources through war, trade, redistribution, or organization. And all of these successful adaptations lead to population increase. But when your population increases, this is going to place greater adaptive stress on your societies, greater adaptive stress on your environment. And at this point, you have to figure out some way to control your population. Do you control it with infanticide? Do you control your population with out-migration? Do you control your population through rigid social stratification or warfare? So you have to pick which of these intensification strategies to develop. But if your intensification strategy is correct, then you've come to a situation where you have successfully adapted to your environment, and that's going to be balanced out by greater population increase. So basically, in this chart, you can see that society is moving into and out of equilibrium with its environment based on these assumed ideas that population increase is always a side effect of successful adaptation. and that population increase always stresses out available resources. And the resources are always stressed out because, remember, all of these human groups are assumed to be using resource optimizing strategies. Now, this is when we start to talk about science itself. Let's actually look at this chart. And if you're into science, and if you've been studying like what we're talking about with, hypothesis testing and the null hypothesis and all that stuff, you should immediately recognize that there are severe problems with all of this. With everything I've described so far, there are major, major problems with it. You can't actually test for any of this stuff. How do you test for this stuff? I mean, what they're doing here is not actually science. You can't test for this stuff. How do you test for increased social stratification? How do you test for outmigration? How do you test for population growth over time? How do you test for trade and redistribution? Major, major problems started to be raised about the new archaeology. And ultimately, when you look at a lot of these flowcharts, especially if you look at that flowchart right there, and you look at it critically, you rapidly come to the conclusion there is absolutely nothing scientific about that flowchart at all. That flowchart is a just so story. That flowchart is simply a narrative told with arrows. It might as well be saying, it might as well be rattling the bone and telling a story around a campfire. It is not a scientific inquiry. And this was one of the problems with the new archaeology. The new archaeology thought that if they could take the trappings of science without the muscle and skeleton of science and make themselves a hard science. Science is not dressing up in a lab coat. Science is not putting on a bow tie. Science is not pouring fluid from one beaker into another. None of that crap matters. Science comes down to crafting a hypothesis, developing a methodology to test the hypothesis, and then testing the hypothesis. That's all that science is. The new archaeology failed, all right? But, I don't want to rag on them too much. The failure of processual archaeology was apparent by the mid-1980s. They had not created general covering laws explaining past human behavior. They had not built middle range theory into this thing that was capable of linking the static processes of the archaeological record to the dynamic past cultural practices. In fact, that doesn't even work because the archaeological record, as we've seen, is not actually static. So processual archaeology failed. But very important things were learned in its failure. The failure of new archaeology was a noble failure. And I'm going to deal with two of the strengths that come out of the new archaeology. And I'm not even going to deal with the little stuff. There's a lot of little things that the new archaeology really taught us to do well. It taught us about sampling strategies. It introduced the use of statistics as a useful tool. It incorporated technologies that had been independently invented. Things like radiocarbon dating, pollen analysis, settlement analysis. All that stuff predates the new archaeology. But it was really incorporated in a way it hadn't really done it before. But there's really two qualified successes, two qualified positive things that come out of the failure of the new archaeology. One of them is that everything must be testable. I do not care how fancy your flowchart is. If you cannot test any of the things that actually exist in your flowchart, you might as well have drawn it in crayon. In fact, you might as well have drawn it in colored chalk on the sidewalk for all the good it's going to do. It doesn't matter how fancy your optimizing scheme is. You have to be able to test it, okay? You can build great towering artifices of hypothetico-deductive logic based on maximizing theory. If you can't test it, none of it means anything, all right? And you can't just have one hypothesis. You must have multiple competing hypotheses, and they must be individually tested against the archaeological record. The simplest of these hypotheses is the most likely one, and there is always the null hypothesis in the back that says everything you've thought of is wrong. The null hypothesis is always present. The second thing is that humans are not systems. Human cultures do not function like systems. Humans do not respond to the world as it objectively exists. They respond to the world as they subjectively perceive it to be. If people think there is a giant canyon running down the middle of the road, they're going to behave as if there is a giant canyon running down the middle of the road, whether that canyon exists or not. Like in the picture above, that's an illusion. It doesn't actually exist. But it doesn't matter. People are going to act like it does. People do not optimize time. They do not enter into these energy maximizing theory. They do not spend time like currency. It's like none of those economic models work. All right? Humans act within the bounds of their own cultural perception. People don't stand there and go, well, should I hunt deer today? Should I try and hunt 2 deer today as opposed to 20 rabbits? That's not how people work. People go, ooh, I should hunt deer today, but today's Thursday and the spirits don't like me to hunt deer on a Thursday. All right. Also, I don't really want to hunt deer. I want to play with my kids all day. And that's what they'll do. Humans generally, and if they really learn an environment, humans don't really have a huge problem finding food. All right. Most of these sort of small scale societies that anthropologists have looked at generally only require about 4 to 6 hours of work a day. And then all the caloric needs are met for several days. Generally people go hunting or people go fishing or people go trapping, not because they're trying to, maximize time or make time efficient decisions, but mostly that's because that's what they feel like doing. That's what the spirits want them to do. And they'll ask them, well, there's lots of deer in that forest. Why don't you hunt that forest? Oh, that forest is haunted. We can't go there. That's what people do. People react to the world not as it objectively exists, but as they subjectively perceive it to be. Economic rationality cannot be assumed in any situation for any culture, okay? So the new archaeology falls apart in the 1980s, and it leads to this theoretical battlefield that sort of scarred archaeology throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. This struggle between the dying of processual archaeology and the rise of rival schools, including this kind of confused school called post-processual archaeology, but we're not going to deal with those guys at all. Basically, what happened was the entire field suffers theoretical exhaustion in the 21st century. And the 21st century experiences the revelation that we don't really need highly developed theoretical approaches at all. Archaeology can function just fine purely as a high-tech scientific methodology. And that's what we'll address next time when we get to our third act. And I will see you there.